On a late September afternoon, Dust Hollow's golden haze rose beneath the sun. The stagecoach door swung open, and it wasn't a smiling bride who stepped down, but Margaret Hale, a black woman clutching a crumpled farewell letter that read, "If I do not return." Whispers rippled through the crowd, contempt tangled with pity, all eyes fixed on her trembling frame. Elias Rowe removed his hat and stood still. The bride he had been waiting for all those months turned out to be a soul shattered, on the verge of collapse. Yet in that moment, through the swirling dust and the venomous murmurs, the quiet cowboy stepped forward, offering a rare stillness. Could love kindle from tears? The stagecoach door creaked open, heavy and worn, as though the iron hinges themselves had grown weary after the long haul from Cheyenne. Dust still hung in the air, curling into frail rings beneath the late September sun of 1873. The crowd gathered outside Dust Hollow's depot had come for one reason only: to catch sight of the newcomer. Weather-worn faces, tanned and carved by wind and grit, all turned toward the coach. There were whispers, the occasional throat clearing, a murmur of restless curiosity. From the cramped shadows inside, Margaret Hale emerged. Her hand, dark-skinned, trembling, clutched the doorframe, the fabric glove at her fingertips already worn through. The faded green hem of her dress brushed the dust, weighted by mud and frayed from too many miles. A wide-brimmed hat veiled half her face, yet could not hide the swollen, reddened eyes, lashes still wet with tears. A black woman stepped down, and for a moment the entire square fell into silence. In her arms, she pressed a crumpled slip of paper tight against her chest, as though it were the last shield keeping her from breaking apart. A corner of the page showed scribbled words, half a sentence unfinished. "If I do not return." A farewell note never sent, now an open confession of despair carried across the miles. Margaret did not smile. She did not nod, nor offer the meek gratitude expected of so many mail-order brides this town had seen before. Instead, she stood trembling, shoulders quaking, until sobs broke loose. They were not loud, yet in the hushed square, each cry struck deep. Elias Rowe, only a few paces away, lifted his hat without thinking. His sun-worn face, rugged from years of prairie work, suddenly seemed awkward and unready. He had prepared a greeting, perhaps a steady smile, a firm handshake, but all of it vanished at the sight of her. His brow furrowed, caught between worry and unease, though he forced a small, steady smile as if to anchor the moment. The crowd could not contain itself. Voices rose in low currents, sharp and unkind. "She's a colored woman. Coming here as someone's wife? Lord above, look, she's holding something. A letter?" The words overlapped like ripples, each one pressing Margaret deeper into herself. She tried to keep her back straight, but her hand clenched the paper so tightly her knuckles whitened. Fresh tears slipped down, staining the letter until the ink blurred like honor itself being washed away. A sudden prairie wind swept through, stirring golden dust into whirling rings. It tugged at her faded skirts, threatened to carry her frail figure away. Yet she stood rooted, shivering, swaying, as if one careless touch might topple her. Elias stepped forward. His worn boots thudded against the wooden planks of the platform. He did not reach out. He knew too well a sudden gesture might startle her further. Instead, he lowered his hat respectfully, dipped his head, and let his gaze soften in his mind. One question echoed, the same thought circling through the bystanders. What sorrow had this woman carried all the way to the west? Margaret said nothing. Her face blurred with tears, fragile yet disarmingly human, stirring something deep even in hardened hearts. The crowd, restless at first, began to drift back, leaving a space open on the dust-worn platform, an empty circle that held only two figures. The air itself seemed weighted, pressing down like stone. Elias knew this moment was nothing like what he had envisioned in the long months of waiting. He had written letters, believed some woman in the East might answer, might join him in building a plain but steady life. He had imagined a bright face, a firm hand taking his to mark the start of a shared journey. Instead, here stood not a smiling bride, but a black woman undone, clutching her own farewell note like proof of a death not yet claimed. The whispers surged again, some edged with pity, others steeped in doubt, still others coated in poorly veiled scorn. Elias heard them all, clear as gunfire, but chose silence. He drew a long breath, stepped once more, until he was standing before her. "Welcome to Dust Hollow," he said, his voice low and even, unsure if the words pierced through her sobbing. Margaret raised her head. Her tear-rimmed eyes met his. For the briefest instant, she saw no contempt there. No hollow pity, only a strange stillness, quiet as a lake unbroken by wind. That calm caught her, stilled her trembling shoulders. Evening light spilled across them, gilding her tear-stained face and catching in the silver of Elias's early-grayed hair. Two figures, the weathered man of the West and the black woman scarred by loss, stood facing one another, framed in dust and the fading whispers. Dust Hollow's depot held its breath. The whole town watched, waiting to see what would unfold. Just minutes before those tears first fell, the Dust Hollow depot had glowed beneath the blaze of a late September sun in 1873. The western light spilled over the far ridges, laying a molten sheen across the prairie's dust. Autumn in Wyoming carried its own stern beauty, the rasp of dry winds, the scorched scent of grass, the vast silence broken only by the crunch of wagon wheels and the steady beat of horses' hooves. On the wooden platform of the modest station, little more than a pine porch beneath a sheet metal roof that ticked and popped in the heat, Elias Rowe waited. He had arrived more than an hour early, not out of fear of missing the stage, but because his cabin had grown unbearable in its emptiness. He had paced the planks until fresh tracks of dust marked his boots. Each round of steps ended the same way, his calloused hand drawing a pocket watch from his friend, snapping it open, watching the seconds spin, then tucking it away again. He had done it no fewer than 4 times, as if staring at the dial might coax the hour closer. Elias was 32. For 6 years he had lived alone on a broad stretch of land at the town's edge. 6 years of cattle and fences that always needed mending, of nights lit by a single oil lamp in a house too large for one man. He had grown accustomed to the hardness of the soil, the cruelty of winter, and the kind of silence that could make a man restless in his own skin. One winter's evening, with the fire crackling low, he had taken up pen and paper. His letter carried no poetry, no promises of love, only honesty. He wrote that he needed a wife, a companion, someone to face the merciless prairie by his side. And now, he stood waiting for the answer to that letter. Tucked in his coat pocket was a creased slip of paper he had read until the ink blurred in his memory. The name Margaret Hale. A woman from Boston who had answered, who had agreed. Her letters were brief, deliberate, courteous yet firm. She had written that she was a teacher, accustomed to work and discipline, seeking a new beginning in the West. In those words, Elias had believed he glimpsed providence, a chance at last to step beyond solitude. He had prepared for her. He had cleaned the house, purchased a few pieces of furniture, asked Mrs. Brennan down the road to sew curtains, even found an old wooden mirror in the general store, thinking surely a woman would want her reflection nearby. Small things, all done with a simple conviction that soon the cabin would no longer echo hollow. The train's whistle carried faintly from the distance, pulling Elias back to the present. He looked up. The rail cars had gone on, leaving passengers to finish their journey by stage. And there, rumbling through the dust, the brown and yellow coach drew near, wheels clattering against the gravel road. Elias swallowed, fingers clenching the watch once more before shoving it back, as though ashamed to show his nerves. When the coach halted before the Hahutson platform, a heavy cloud of dust rose, swallowing the scene in a golden veil. Sunlight speared through, turning the haze into a shifting curtain between Elias and whatever fate the West had sent him. The smell of dry earth, the musk of horse sweat, mingled with the driver's rasping voice. "Long haul from Cheyenne. Passenger inside never said a word the whole way. Hard to figure, Ro." Elias nodded, too tight-throated for speech. His heart pounded against his ribs, loud enough to drown the driver's mutter. He drew a breath, tugged his hat brim straight, trying to don once more the mask of composure, the stoic, steady man folks knew him to be. The driver unlatched the coach door. The iron hinges moaned through the dust. Townsfolk pressed closer, a hush falling, as if the prairie itself leaned in. Elias squared his shoulders, readying himself to step forward, to offer a hand, to greet the woman whose image had lived in his thoughts for months. He had pictured it so plainly, a lady from the East, perhaps shy, perhaps uneasy with the wild horizon, but smiling faintly as she met him, nodding once before they set off together toward a new life. But that moment never came. Sunlight slashed through the dust. The door swung wide. A trembling hand gripped the frame. A faded green hem brushed the step. Then a small figure emerged. But instead of the hesitant smile he had dreamed, Elias met eyes swollen and red, a face streaked with tears. A black woman stood before him, clutching a crumpled letter to her breast as though it were her last tether. Elias faltered. All greetings, all tidy visions of a simple beginning, vanished into the golden haze of that September afternoon. The small wagon carrying them away from Dust Hollow rolled slow, wheels grinding against the hardened earth left parched after a long, rainless summer. The sound drummed steady, a hollow rhythm that blended with the sweep of wind through sunburnt grass. Evening was settling, the light weaker now, casting the prairie in bronze and stretching the wagon's shadow, and those of the two within it, into wavering streaks that rose and fell with every rut in the road. Elias held the reins, his broad hands steady on the worn leather straps. He was used to driving alone, mile after mile with only the breath of horses and the howl of wind for company. But today another presence sat beside him, one unfamiliar, and weighed with a despair he could not yet name. He risked a glance. Margaret Hale sat pressed against the edge of the bench, clutching a faded handkerchief, eyes cast downward. Her posture, rigid and guarded, seemed to shrink the cramped space even further. Silence stretched. Only the creak of wood and the rasp of wind over the wagon's canvas filled the air. Elias thought he ought to say something, some small remark about the road or the weather, but his throat was dry, the words slipping like sand through his grasp. Just as he gathered breath to speak, Margaret's voice broke through. "I was a school teacher in Boston." Her tone was low, husky, each word deliberate, as though carried too long and now spilling through the first crack in her resolve. Elias kept his gaze on the road, gave a small nod, and waited. "It was the work I loved, nearly all I had. I loved the children, their reciting voices, the feel of chalk between my fingers, the blackboard beneath my hand. But it ended, all because of one refusal." The wagon jolted over a stone. Margaret did not flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if she were recounting a story that no longer belonged to her. The headmaster's son, a boy who thought the world was his by right. He took notice of me. I knew what that meant, and I turned him down. Once, firmly. That was all. But it was enough to make me his target. Her voice tightened. She twisted the handkerchief until her knuckles showed white. Elias said nothing, though a stir rose inside him, a familiar recognition of being cast aside, judged by eyes that had never cared for truth. "Rumors spread faster than fire in dry grass," she continued. "They said I had enticed him, then discarded him, that I was shameless, using my looks to climb higher. No one asked what was true, and his father, the headmaster himself, believed every word from his son." Another jolt rocked the wagon, but Margaret's spine stayed straight. Her reddened eyes no longer held tears, only the smoldering weight of an old injustice. "They dismissed me. No school in the city would take a woman stained by such talk. I went door to door pleading for a post. Every door shut. In 1 week, I went from being loved by children to being branded, a disgrace, shunned at every turn." Elias swallowed hard. Dust caught in his coat, but he scarcely noticed. In his mind, he pictured the classroom, children's bright faces lifted to her, and then, all gone in the space of a rumor. Margaret lowered her gaze, her voice dropping near a whisper. "I knew I had done nothing wrong, but in a place like Boston, truth never weighs as much as whispers." The wagon slowed as it struck a patch of mud left by the season's first rain. The wheels slid, and Elias pulled the reins firm to keep the horses steady. When the wagon leveled again, he stole a glance. Margaret sat unmoving, her face darkened by the fading sun. He wanted to speak, wanted to say she owed him no explanation, that the past could not chain her here. But the words locked behind his lips. Elias was not a man of speech. For 6 years, the prairie had been his only companion, and the prairie never asked for comfort in return. So he let the silence stay. Not a hollow silence, but one with weight, like a blanket laid over a shivering body. The wheels turned on, dust rising to coat Margaret's dress, Elias's boots, and the calloused hands of them both. Above, a hawk wheeled wide, its shadow crossing the cracked ground. Margaret's eyes followed it, and for a moment they glimmered with longing, as though she too might rise and leave behind the chains of her past. But instead she gripped the handkerchief tighter, drew a long breath, and braced herself for what still lay buried, secrets deeper yet waiting their turn. The wagon wheels rattled over rough ground, a harsh grinding echo rising from the parched earth. Wind swept dust across Margaret's faded skirts, dulling their weary blue even further. She sat upright, thin hands clutched tight around the handkerchief, her eyes fixed far into the blurred expanse of prairie. Her face bore the weight of a wound freshly spoken, as though the words themselves still hovered between them. Silence stretched long. Elias kept the reins steady, his gaze pinned to the road ahead, yet his thoughts circled around the woman beside him. He felt the weight of her confession, the injustice sharp enough to shatter anyone. But Margaret's voice came again, lower now, trembling yet unflinching. And then, they said I had stolen from the school funds. The words, scarcely louder than a sigh, landed heavy as an iron bell. Elias's grip faltered on the reins before tightening again, his knuckles pale against the leather. The wagon jolted over stones, the sound mingling with the unseen chorus of false accusations. Margaret lifted her face, eyes swollen but steady, hardened by repetition. I never touched a cent. But who cared? Their words were enough. The account books disappeared overnight, and every finger pointed to me. A black woman, alone with no family, no protector. I was the easiest one to blame. Her mouth pressed thin, the skin blanching at the corners. The prairie wind hissed past, carrying dust and the echo of a city that had long since turned its back on her. Elias remained wordless. His eyes narrowed on the trail, a deep crease carved at their edges. Inside, though, a storm coiled tight. He had heard stories of injustice before, of the powerful grinding down the powerless. But hearing it from the lips of the woman seated beside him, the woman meant to be his wife, cut sharper than any tale. Margaret gave a crooked, bitter smile. I remember the morning they claimed the ledgers were found missing. A cluster of teachers whispering in the hallway, their eyes on me. When the headmaster came, he didn't ask a thing. He looked straight at me and said, "We've been betrayed from within." And that was it. No trial, no proof, I was condemned. Her hand brushed a tear from her cheek, then fell limp, her gaze drifting into the endless prairie horizon. I fought it. I knocked on doors, but they needed no truth, only a scapegoat. With the rumor of his son already clinging to me, every lie sounded like fact. Past turned to evidence, slander turned to gospel. I had nothing left to stand on. The wagon pitched hard over a ridge, and Elias reined in sharply, holding the wheels steady. In that moment, he turned and let himself look at her. What he saw was not only the streaks of grief and exhaustion, but beneath them a glimmer of something more. A fragile strength refusing to bow. Margaret felt his eyes and turned away, her voice softening, more to herself than to him. I thought of leaving it all behind. I wrote a letter, left it on the table. Just one line. If I do not return, I meant to disappear, let them believe whatever they wished. But I couldn't. Some part of me refused to end that way. Then I saw the notice at the post office. Men in the West seeking wives. And I wrote to you. The sky deepened into purple dusk, autumn's chorus of insects rising in the tall grass. The road stretched like a red river before them, unending. Margaret's words lingered heavy, each syllable like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading wide. Elias drew a long breath, chest taut beneath his coat. He still said nothing. For a man of few words, silence was no neglect. It was the only way to hold the weight of another's pain without breaking it apart. His eyes tightened, holding layers, anger for the injustice that had driven her out, confusion at the storm-torn past of the bride he had summoned, and, woven strangely among it, a growing reverence. She had not chosen death. She had carried every wound, every shame, and walked toward this harsh frontier to begin again. Elias pressed his lips together, his fingers tapping once against the reins. A small gesture, but one the prairie sky bore witness to. He had heard her, and he had understood. The wagon rolled on through falling dusk. Silence enclosed them again, but it was no longer suffocating. It was thick, solid, weighted with the truth she had laid bare. And Elias knew, from this moment forward, he could not see Margaret Hale as merely a wife ordered by letter. She was a woman forged through fire, scarred but unbroken. And the question rose like a challenge in his own heart. Was he enough, strong enough, steadfast enough to guard that fragile flame from being snuffed out once more? The wagon turned off the main southern road, following a trail cut through fields of autumn gold. The early fall wind rolled across the tall grass in waves, the prairie bending and swaying like a restless sea, spilling out to the farthest rim of sky. The sun had dipped westward, throwing deep crimson light that painted long, wavering shadows ahead of them. Elias held the reins firm, urging the team onward. Every rise and rut of the land was known to him. The patch of scarred earth where lightning had once split a tree. The faint smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire drifting faint through the air. Each sign told him home was near. But today, with the woman seated beside him, the sight of his homestead was not a simple return. It was an unveiling, an introduction, a beginning. The wagon jolted as it climbed a rise. Then, cresting the ridge, the house came into view. Elias's two-story dwelling, small and square against the vastness. Weathered timber walls, roof pitched low, a wide porch stretched across the front, with a few rough chairs set out. Beyond lay barns and corrals, fences circling grazing land, where cattle dotted the distance like ink strokes across pale grass. Margaret lifted her gaze. Her eyes, still worn from the weight of her confessions, flickered with something hard to name. Strangeness, unease, perhaps even a thread of fragile hope. The house was no grand estate, no polished eastern dwelling, yet it stood firm, a period mark of stubbornness upon the wild prairie. Elias glanced sideways, searching her face for some sign, some spark of a scent that might tell him he had offered enough. But before he could speak, a voice rang out across the fields. "Eli!" The call struck him like a hand to the chest. He pulled the reins, the wagon lurching to a halt before the yard. From between rows of corn now turning yellow stepped a woman, quick in stride, skirts of plain beige swaying, hair tied high. She looked near her 30s, but the brightness of her smile, the lively shine of her eyes, made her seem younger still. Nora Brennan. Elias stiffened. His grip on the reins tightened, hesitation flickering across his face. He turned toward Margaret, ready to speak. But Nora had already come closer, her voice warm, easy, unhesitant. "Eli, you're back? I saw the dust rising, thought it must be you." Margaret froze. Her fingers clutched at her skirt, her heart catching at the sound, not at the woman's sudden appearance, but at the way she said it. Eli. The name rolled off her tongue with an ease, a familiarity that pierced like a thorn. Elias removed his hat, his smile faltering. This is Margaret Hale," he said quickly, voice roughened. "And this is Nora Brennan, a kind neighbor who's helped me these many years." Margaret gave a small nod, polite but reserved. Nora, by contrast, smiled wide, stepping to the wagon's edge. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Nora. I suppose you must be the one Elias wrote about in his letters east. The air thinned. A silence, brief but taut, settled between them. Elias hefted a trunk from the wagon bed, throat clearing. Thank you, Nora. I'll see Margaret inside now. But Nora lingered, her eyes bright, carrying a glint that no smile could soften. Something old, a bond not fully severed, perhaps only friendship, perhaps something left unspoken. Margaret saw it, and her heart clenched. Wind swept across the yard, dust swirling. 3 figures stood in the fading light, each bound by unvoiced thoughts. Elias turned aside, busying his hands with the harness, but his movements were stiff, awkward where they were once sure. The house door stood open, awaiting escape. Yet the air had shifted. With the homestead's first unveiling came another presence, the shadow of Nora Brennan, whose familiar voice had tilted the ground beneath them. Margaret stepped down from the wagon, her shoes crunching on the dry earth. She said nothing, only let her eyes take in the house, the yard, the woman standing nearby. All of it fused into one tableau, her new beginning framed not by simple welcome, but by the hint of a story already tangled before she ever arrived. Nora lingered in the yard, her smile still bright, but Margaret saw what could not be hidden, the tether of something unfinished, an invisible thread tying Nora to Elias, like embers still warm beneath a crust of ash. No word was needed, only the way she called him Eli, the glint in her eyes, and Margaret knew. There had been something between them once, or at least a longing left unmet. The air seemed to sag heavy. The prairie wind kept sweeping dust through the yard, but even that restlessness could not lift the weight pressing down. Elias bent over the harness, his movements rigid, shoulders taut, as though shielding himself from both women's eyes. Margaret stood still, hands loose at her sides, feeling less like a bride come home than a guest stepping into a house already claimed. "You've returned sooner than I thought," Nora said at last, her voice gentle. But beneath its ease lay another layer, shaded with something unspoken. "I expected you'd linger longer at the station." Elias raised his head, answering quickly. "The road was clear. I wanted to bring Margaret home. Let her rest." Margaret heard the word rest, yet it did not soothe her. The way Nora's presence clung to the moment had already sown seeds of doubt that rustled now inside her chest. Nora turned, her gaze steady on Margaret. The smile stayed, though her eyes slowed, measuring. "You've traveled far. Wyoming's plains aren't kind to newcomers, but you'll grow accustomed. I helped Eli with many things here. If you should ever need anything, you may come to me." Margaret inclined her head. "Thank you." The words left her lips politely, but their weight had shifted. Helped Eli with many things here. Spoken lightly, yet stamped like a claim across the years. Elias set down her trunk on the porch, turning with deliberate calm. "Thank you, Nora. But tonight Margaret needs rest most of all." His voice was even, yet his eyes flickered away, unable to meet them both at once. Nora nodded, her smile thinning. "Of course, I won't intrude further. Welcome to Dust Hollow, Margaret." She turned, her skirts stirring dust, and disappeared among the tall, yellowing corn. The sound of her steps faded, leaving only the rustle of stalks and the raw scent of turned earth. Margaret's gaze followed until the figure was gone, her heart tightening with a question she dared not voice. Had Elias sought a wife from the east because he longed for a true companion, or simply to patch the hollow left by someone he could not claim? Elias came beside her, pushing the door wide. "Come in," he said, his voice low, rasped. Margaret gathered her trunk, stepping across the threshold. The house opened before her. The smell of aged wood, the plain neatness of a man's careful order. Curtains freshly sewn, chairs straightened, shelves set right. It was all prepared for her. And yet in her eyes, every detail carried the shadow of Nora's lingering glance. Elias cleared his throat. "I'll fetch water for you to wash. You must be weary." Margaret nodded. She asked nothing more. But inside, a taut string had been drawn, binding her, Elias, and the shadow just vanished into the corn. A string no one could see, yet strong enough to tug at her every thought. Later, when Elias led the horses into the barn, Margaret stood at the upstairs window, watching the yard below. The crescent moon laid silver across the roof. Elias's shadow stretched long on the dust. He moved with practiced ease, the motions of a man who had worked this land alone for years. Yet beyond the fields glimmered a softer light, an oil lamp from the Brennan house, flickering gold against the dark. Margaret drew back, lowering her eyes. She sank onto the wooden bed, fingers brushing the worn handle of her trunk. The silence pressed close, and with it returned the question, relentless as the wind whistling through the boards. Did he marry me to begin anew or to forget another? When Elias returned, carrying a basin and towel, he set them down gently. Their eyes met for a breath, his carrying words unsaid, hers carrying questions she would not voice. She smiled faintly in thanks, but the smile never reached her eyes. Outside, the prairie wind howled. The homestead stood steady in the moonlight, yet within its walls 2 strangers kept their silence, each shadowed by a presence not yet gone. And from the very first night, Margaret knew the battle ahead would not be against the land alone, but against ghosts of the heart that still lingered here. The first days at the ranch slipped by in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Margaret learned to move within its order, the rooster's crow at dawn, the jangle of bells when Elias swung the gate to drive cattle into the pasture, the faint sweetness of cut hay drifting on the wind. She tried her hand at lighting the stove, drawing water from the well, even dared to step into the cattle barn, where the heat and pungent smell had first made her hesitate. Elias spoke little, working as he always had, letting her watch, giving only short, steady instructions when needed. Bit by bit, the fragments of a new life began to stitch themselves around her. Yet even within that quiet, another shadow lingered. The golden lamplight across the Brennan fields each evening. The memory of Nora's voice calling Eli. Margaret carried it like a stone lodged deep in her chest, weighty and unyielding. That afternoon, the sky turned. While Margaret gathered hay at the porch, she noticed the horizon to the west darkening into a wall of cloud, dense and low as iron. The air grew heavy. Small birds darted in sudden flight toward their nests. The hay lay still. The silence was unnatural, as if the world itself held its breath before a strike. "Inside," Elias said sharply, striding from the stable, shovel still in his hand. His tone was steady, but beneath it she heard urgency. She nodded, but before she could lift the basket, the wind came. It tore across the yard in a single sweep, scattering hay into the air. Margaret staggered, hair whipping loose from its knot, lashing her face raw. Elias's hand caught her arm, rough and firm, hauling her close. The world shifted in an instant. Darkness swallowed the sun, sky and earth bound in a fury of dust. Wind screamed, carrying grit and sand that blinded the eyes. The roof groaned, timbers creaking as though ready to tear free. "The stable!" Elias shouted, his voice battling the gale. He knew the house walls would not hold against the season's first violent storm. Margaret did not think. She only felt his grip, iron tight, pulling her forward. Together they plunged through the yard, rain bursting from the sky in fat drops that stung like corn kernels hurled by a furious hand. Her skirt clung heavy around her legs, each step dragging her backward. Wind drove at them, rain beat down. But Elias bent his body over hers, his arm braced before her chest, forcing a path. The stable door shrieked on its hinges, banging hard against the wall. Elias thrust her inside first, then slammed it shut, ramming the wooden bar down to brace it. Inside, dimness swallowed them. The acrid scent of hay and animal musk hung thick. Horses stamped and snorted, panicked by the roar above. Margaret slumped against the plank wall, dress soaked through, hair plastered to her cheek. Her chest heaved, heart pounding not only from the storm, but from the weight of his hand still burning on her arm, as though without it, she might indeed have been carried away. Elias struck a match and lit the oil lamp. The flame wavered, weak against the draft, but cast a glow over his face. Rain and sweat running together, eyes dark and unwavering. He moved swiftly down the stalls, calming each frightened horse, tightening the reins, murmuring low until the chaos eased to stamping breaths. Rain hammered the roof in relentless sheets, every strike threatening to split the boards. Wind found the cracks and howled through, nearly snuffing the lamp. Shadows lurched and bent against the walls, flickering with each gust. Margaret hugged her damp handkerchief to her chest, curling into herself in the corner. Boston, its classrooms, its stone-paved streets, was a world away, a dream dissolved. Here was only the screaming prairie, and she, confined to a stable with a man who was little more than a stranger. Elias returned, crouched near her. His breath was still quick, but his voice had steadied. "It will pass. We only need to wait." She nodded, though her eyes remained on the sputtering lamp. The storm outside thrashed with a fury that seemed more than weather. It was reminder and warning. Nothing here would ever be secure. Her fingers clenched around the wet cloth, eyes fixed on the lamplight quivering against the wall. Elias's shadow rose tall and solid there, strong, unyielding, yet lined with weariness. And in that moment, through the howl of wind and the hammer of rain, Margaret realized this was not only the storm of nature. It was the moment that would strip them bare, forcing each to face what they carried within. The storm raged on, the roof shuddered, but in the narrow space of the stable the world had shrunk to two people, a fragile lamp, and a silence loud as truth. And Margaret knew, before the night was done, she might hear words that would change everything. The wind outside screamed as though it meant to wrench the roof away. The stable shuddered with each lash of the storm. The oil lamp flickered, flame shrinking back, barely carving a pool of light where Elias and Margaret sat opposite each other. The horses snorted and stamped, the smell of damp hay thick with the drip of rain. It was a harsh shelter, yet strangely intimate, as though the storm itself had forced them near, bound by the same fragile flame of breath in the dark. Elias leaned forward, forearms on his knees, calloused hands clenched together as though holding in words that threatened to break loose. For a long while he stayed silent, eyes fixed on the wavering lamp. Then at last his voice came, deep and ragged, woven into the howl of the wind. "Margaret, there's something I've never spoken in this place. Perhaps tonight, in this storm, is the time." She lifted her head. The lamplight traced her face, eyes wide, still edged with fear. Her fingers gripped the damp cloth in her lap, waiting. "I once had a betrothal," Elias said, breath drawn hard. "Before the war, back in Pennsylvania, we promised each other. I went to fight, carrying her face like a lantern to see me through. But the man who returned was not the one who left. I came home scarred, not just skin, but inside." His voice faltered. The storm rattled the boards, wind tearing at the cracks. Margaret saw the tremor at his shoulders, the shadow of grief he had buried in silence. She didn't know me anymore. Or maybe she chose not to. She said she wanted the man who'd gone to war, not the one who came back with darkness in his eyes. So it ended. I left everything, came west, built this ranch, alone. Margaret's chest tightened. She knew those words, knew their weight, because her own story bore the same scars. She heard the bitterness in him, a wound hidden under work and dust, but never healed. Her hand shook. At last she reached for the small trunk beside her, drew out a folded paper, edges worn and ink-stained. She bit her lip, voice breaking but steady. "If you've spoken, then I cannot keep silence either." Elias watched as she unfolded the letter, its creases frayed, its words blurred. She held it out, voice raw. "This, I wrote before I left Boston. Only one line. If I do not return. I meant to leave it behind, then vanish. When honor was gone, when slander became truth, I thought there was no reason left to go on." Tears splashed onto the page, soaking ink that had long bled. Margaret trembled, but her eyes clung to his. "I never sent it. I carried it here. Proof of how close I came. Tonight I show you, because I will not begin this life with a lie." The stable stilled. Outside the storm raged, but between them hung a silence thick as iron. Elias's gaze fell to the paper, then rose into hers, eyes wet with grief but steady with resolve. At last his hand reached, calloused fingers brushing the fragile sheet. He traced the blurred line, then looked up, voice husky. "Both of us once chose to let go, yet here we sit. That means we chose different. We stayed." Margaret's shoulders shook, but for the first time, her eyes carried something beyond despair, a fragile spark that dared to believe there was life beyond ruin. Elias leaned nearer, not rushing, only enough that the lamp's glow held them both within the same circle. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I can't promise much. I'm not whole. I carry shadows of war. But I know this. I want to begin again. Not to fill emptiness. Not to forget, to build something new. If you want that too." Her lips quivered. She folded the letter, pressing it to her chest. "Oh, I do. I want to live. And if it must begin from ruins, at least I will not be alone." Outside, the tempest roared, But inside the stable they found another refuge, not just from wind and rain, but from the weight of silence and lies. They sat there, without more words, listening to their hearts beat with the storm. A pact had formed, unspoken yet sure. From here forward, they would walk in truth, however rough the path. And when the lamp flame bent low, casting its gold on their weary faces, it showed not victims but survivors, two souls who had once chosen death, but now chose life. They no longer wanted merely to endure. They wanted to begin. Sunday dawned with the ringing of the church bell, its sound carrying across the wide, clear sky of the prairie. The notes rolled over golden fields, drifted through cottonwood groves, and gathered the folk of Dust Hollow from every direction. The small wooden church, its paint worn pale by sun and wind, filled to bursting. Wagons rattled to a halt along the dirt road, raising clouds of dust. Children scampered across the yard, their laughter sharp and bright, while mothers tugged collars straight and fathers brushed hats before stepping inside. Within, the pews groaned under the weight of a crowd rarely seen. Murmurs rippled, glances darted, all drawn to one thing: the wedding of Elias Rowe, the man who had lived alone so long on the edge of the prairie, to Margaret Hale, the woman newly come from the east. Margaret sat near the front, her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles whitened. The turquoise dress, borrowed from a kindly neighbor, was faded but serviceable, and when light fell through the small pane of glass, it lent her a soft glow like mist. Her hair was drawn back, her dark skin standing out among the sea of pale faces. Eyes pressed upon her, curious, cautious, and, some, hard with judgment. She held her spine straight, gaze lowered, bearing the silent storm. Beside her, Elias sat in a rarely worn suit, fabric worn thin at the elbows but neat. His beard trimmed, hair combed back, his sun-browned brow exposed. He looked less the solitary rancher than a man prepared to stand before his people, unashamed in his choice. The minister's voice filled the rafters, words of prayer rising above the shuffle of boots on wooden boards. Children at the back craned to see, their mothers' hands keeping them still. Tension thickened the air. All waited for the moment the bride and groom would rise and speak vows none had ever imagined Elias Rowe would make. Elias rose, extending his hand. Margaret laid hers atop it, her slender fingers swallowed by his broad, scarred palm. He gave the faintest squeeze. "I am here." She drew breath, let him guide her forward. Whispers rippled behind them, sharp against her ears, reminders of every rumor once hurled at her. Still she walked. Before the pulpit they halted, light striking through the small window, laying across their faces. Elias tilted his head, eyes unwavering. Margaret lifted hers, wet but steady. The minister opened the Bible, voice solemn. "Today we witness the union of Elias Rowe and Margaret Hale." Each word fell like a drumbeat. The room stilled, the prairie wind outside knocking faintly at the wooden walls. Then, hoofbeats. The pounding struck like thunder, echoing against the church walls. Every head turned. Dust swirled in the sunlight as the horse conked to a halt outside, heavy breath snorting. The minister faltered, glancing toward the door. Elias's grip tightened around Margaret's hand. Her heart slammed, each beat loud in her ears. Through the narrow glass, figure loomed. A man astride a horse, his frame tall, coat coated with trail dust, hat pulled low. His shadow cut across the light, long and dark, like a blade slashed into the morning. Whispers broke loose, anxious, suspicious. The air that had been solemn turned sharp, uneasy. Elias inhaled deep, met the minister's eye, and gave the smallest nod. Continue. But the silence of the rider, waiting beyond the threshold, pressed heavy, as though daring the walls themselves to hold. Margaret's chest tightened. She remembered Boston, the stairs, the accusations. Now here, in this new land where she had hoped to begin again, it seemed the past had ridden hard after her, halting at the very doors of her wedding. The wind keened, the horse stamped, and the congregation sat frozen. Only Elias and Margaret, hand in hand, stood before the pulpit, between a love barely planted and the shadow that had come knocking. The wind outside screamed as though it meant to wrench the roof away. The stable shuddered with each lash of the storm. The oil lamp flickered, flame shrinking back, barely carving a pool of light where Elias and Margaret sat opposite each other. The horses snorted and stamped, the smell of damp hay thick with the drip of rain. It was a harsh shelter, yet strangely intimate, as though the storm itself had forced them near, bound by the same fragile flame of breath in the dark. Elias leaned forward, forearms on his knees, calloused hands clenched together as though holding in words that threatened to break loose. For a long while he stayed silent, eyes fixed on the wavering lamp. Then at last his voice came, deep and ragged, woven into the howl of the wind. Margaret, there's something I've never spoken in this place. Perhaps tonight, in this storm, is the time. She lifted her head. The lamplight traced her face, eyes wide, still edged with fear. Her fingers gripped the damp cloth in her lap, waiting. I once had a betrothal, Elias said, breath drawn hard. Before the war, back in Pennsylvania, we promised each other. I went to fight, carrying her face like a lantern to see me through. But the man who returned was not the one who left. I came home scarred, not just skin, but inside. His voice faltered. The storm rattled the boards, wind tearing at the cracks. Margaret saw the tremor at his shoulders, the shadow of grief he had buried in silence. She didn't know me anymore. Or maybe she chose not to. She said she wanted the man who'd gone to war, not the one who came back with darkness in his eyes. So it ended. I left everything, came west, built this ranch, alone. Margaret's chest tightened. She knew those words, knew their weight, because her own story bore the same scars. She heard the bitterness in him, a wound hidden under work and dust, but never healed. Her hand shook. At last she reached for the small trunk beside her, drew out a folded paper, edges worn and ink-stained. She bit her lip, voice breaking but steady. If you've spoken, then I cannot keep silence either. Elias watched as she unfolded the letter, its creases frayed, its words blurred. She held it out, voice raw. This, I wrote before I left Boston. Only one line. If I do not return, I meant to leave it behind, then vanish. When honor was gone, when slander became truth, I thought there was no reason left to go on. Tears splashed onto the page, soaking ink that had long bled. Margaret trembled, but her eyes clung to his. I never sent it. I carried it here. Proof of how close I came. Tonight I show you, because I will not begin this life with a lie." The stable stilled. Outside the storm raged, but between them hung a silence thick as iron. Elias's gaze fell to the paper, then rose into hers, eyes wet with grief but steady with resolve. At last his hand reached, calloused fingers brushing the fragile sheet. He traced the blurred line, then looked up, voice husky. "Both of us once chose to let go, yet here we sit. That means we chose different. We stayed." Margaret's shoulders shook, but for the first time, her eyes carried something beyond despair, a fragile spark that dared to believe there was life beyond ruin. Elias leaned nearer, not rushing, only enough that the lamp's glow held them both within the same circle. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I can't promise much. I'm not whole. I carry shadows of war. But I know this. I want to begin again. Not to fill emptiness, not to forget, to build something new. If you want that too." Her lips quivered. She folded the letter, pressing it to her chest. "Oh, I do. I want to live. And if it must begin from ruins, at least I will not be alone." Outside, the tempest roared, but inside the stable they found another refuge, not just from wind and rain, but from the weight of silence and lies. They sat there, without more words, listening to their hearts beat with the storm. A pact had formed, unspoken yet sure. From here forward, they would walk in truth, however rough the path. And when the lamp flame bent low, casting its gold on their weary faces, it showed not victims but survivors, two souls who had once chosen death, but now chose life. They no longer wanted merely to endure. They wanted to begin. Sunday dawned with the ringing of the church bell, its sound carrying across the wide, clear sky of the prairie. The notes rolled over golden fields, drifted through cottonwood groves, and gathered the folk of Dust Hollow from every direction. The small wooden church, its paint worn pale by sun and wind, filled to bursting. Wagons rattled to a halt along the dirt road, raising clouds of dust. Children scampered across the yard, their laughter sharp and bright, while mothers tugged collars straight and fathers brushed hats before stepping inside. Within, the pews groaned under the weight of a crowd rarely seen. Murmurs rippled, glances darted, all drawn to one thing: the wedding of Elias Rowe, the man who had lived alone so long on the edge of the prairie, to Margaret Hale, the woman newly come from the east. Margaret sat near the front, her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles whitened. The turquoise dress, borrowed from a kindly neighbor, was faded but serviceable, and when light fell through the small pane of glass, it lent her a soft glow like mist. Her hair was drawn back, her dark skin standing out among the sea of pale faces. Eyes pressed upon her, curious, cautious, and, some, hard with judgment. She held her spine straight, gaze lowered, bearing the silent storm. Beside her, Elias sat in a rarely worn suit, fabric worn thin at the elbows but neat. His beard trimmed, hair combed back, his sun-browned brow exposed. He looked less the solitary rancher than a man prepared to stand before his people, unashamed in his choice. The minister's voice filled the rafters, words of prayer rising above the shuffle of boots on wooden boards. Children at the back craned to see, their mothers' hands keeping them still. Tension thickened the air. All waited for the moment the bride and groom would rise and speak vows, none had ever imagined Elias Rowe would make. Elias rose, extending his hand. Margaret laid hers atop it, her slender fingers swallowed by his broad, scarred palm. He gave the faintest squeeze. "I am here." She drew breath, let him guide her forward. Whispers rippled behind them, sharp against her ears, reminders of every rumor once hurled at her. Still she walked. Before the pulpit they halted, light striking through the small window, laying across their faces. Elias tilted his head, eyes unwavering. Margaret lifted hers, wet but steady. The minister opened the Bible, voice solemn. "Today we witness the union of Elias Rowe and Margaret Hale." Each word fell like a drumbeat. The room stilled, the prairie wind outside knocking faintly at the wooden walls. Then, hoofbeats. The pounding struck like thunder, echoing against the church walls. Every head turned. Dust swirled in the sunlight as the horse conked to a halt outside, heavy breath snorting. The minister faltered, glancing toward the door. Elias's grip tightened around Margaret's hand. Her heart slammed, each beat loud in her ears. Through the narrow glass, figure loomed. A man astride a horse, his frame tall, coat coated with trail dust, hat pulled low. His shadow cut across the light, long and dark, like a blade slashed into the morning. Whispers broke loose, anxious, suspicious. The air that had been solemn turned sharp, uneasy. Elias inhaled deep, met the minister's eye, and gave the smallest nod. "Continue." But the silence of the rider, waiting beyond the threshold, pressed heavy, as though daring the walls themselves to hold. Margaret's chest tightened. She remembered Boston, the stairs, the accusations. Now here, in this new land where she had hoped to begin again, it seemed the past had ridden hard after her, halting at the very doors of her wedding. The wind keened, the horse stamped, and the congregation sat frozen. Only Elias and Margaret, hand in hand, stood before the pulpit, between a love barely planted and the shadow that had come knocking. The church door creaked open, dry and sharp. A shaft of sunlight cut across the aisle where Margaret and Elias stood before the pulpit. A stranger filled the doorway, tall and unmoving, hat pulled low to hide half his face. He did not step inside at once. He lingered on the threshold, his gaze sweeping the crowded room until it fixed on Margaret. Silence swelled, heavy and suffocating. Children stilled. Men leaned forward. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks. The man's mouth curled faintly. His voice, low and rasped, carried to every ear. "Boston hasn't forgotten you, schoolteacher." Each word struck like steel. The church froze. All eyes snapped toward Margaret. Whispers she thought buried. Accusations she had confessed to Elias in secret. Suddenly they rose again, alive in the still air. Margaret stiffened, eyes wide, lungs burning for breath. In her head came the echoes, laughter sharp as knives, the scrape of benches, a young man's voice flinging lies without proof. Boston came roaring back, as if Dust Hollow's chapel had become that hall where her honor was stripped away. Elias felt the tremor in her hand. At once he tightened his grip, stepping forward, broad shoulders blocking her from view. His voice cut the silence, firm, resonant. "This is my wife, and to me, that is all that matters." The words landed like hammer blows, sure and unyielding. Murmurs died. The stranger's smirk faltered. He shifted, as if to speak again, But Elias's stare, hard, immovable, met his and held. A taut moment passed, challenge unspoken. Then the man snorted, turned on his heel. Boots struck the porch. The horse snorted, hooves clattered. In seconds the sound faded into the prairie, leaving only a thick, ringing quiet. Elias did not release Margaret's hand. He turned, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "She is my wife, and I will not permit anyone, to drag the past into what we build here." The words rolled through the rafters. No one answered, but the silence shifted. It was no longer doubt, no longer suspicion, but acknowledgement. Elias Rowe had chosen, and none had the right to contest. The minister, after a pause, inclined his head and turned the page. His voice rose again, steady, like water flowing once more after a stone is moved. "Let us continue." Margaret's chest loosened. Her eyes brimmed, not from fear alone, but from the anchor of Elias's hand wrapped around hers. It was her tether, holding her to the present, keeping her from being swept back into Boston's abyss. The vows followed, solemn and plain. Elias spoke each word with unwavering strength, his eyes locked to hers. When it was her turn, Margaret's voice quavered at first, then steadied, each syllable carrying weight. "I, Margaret Hale, do promise." No flourishes. Only the raw truth of a choice remade. The minister closed the Bible. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Elias, you may kiss your bride." Elias bent slowly. Margaret lifted her face, tears glistening, lips trembling. Their kiss was not wild nor swift, but firm, deep, a seal that cleaved them from the shadows of yesterday. The congregation hushed. Then a lone clap sounded, joined by another, until a tide of applause filled the room, honest and strong. Even the hardest faces softened. Margaret leaned into Elias as they turned, facing their people. She knew the past still lingered. She knew the accusations were not erased, but she also knew she would not bear them alone. As they walked down the aisle together, sunlight streamed through the small windows, falling across their faces. And Margaret felt it deep. This day was not only a wedding, it was her rebirth. Before the very eyes of those who once doubted, they had witnessed a love born from truth, stronger than rumor, stronger than shame. That afternoon, the prairie lay beneath a blanket of gold as the sun leaned westward. The voices of Dust Hollow carried on the wind, hoofbeats fading down the road, laughter, low whispers. Folks would speak of this day for years. Elias Rowe, the silent rancher of the borderland, had taken a bride from the east, a woman who had arrived with tears in her eyes and a past that clung like dust. In the wagon on the road home, Margaret leaned against the wooden rail, watching the endless grass ripple like water under the wind. The echo of the stranger's cruel words still stung her chest, but Elias's hand covered hers, warm and firm, reminding her she was no longer alone. When they reached the ranch, Elias stepped down first, then circled back, offering his hand. His gesture was not mere courtesy. It was an invitation, a placing of her at his side. His eyes carried a weight she had not seen before, solemn and unshaken. "Margaret," he said, voice deep as the dusk, "before we cross this threshold again, there is something I must do, not only for you, but for every soul in Dust Hollow." He led her into the parlor. From a drawer in the oak cabinet, he drew out a bundle wrapped in stiff paper, the land deeds, the ranch titles, every sheet that bound his name to the earth beneath their feet. He spread them on the table. The lamplight glowed amber across the faded ink. Turning to the page that bore his name, Elias Rowe, lawful owner of the Rowe Ranch, he dipped a steel nib into the inkwell. Without hesitation, he pressed it to the parchment and wrote beside his own, Margaret Rowe. The scratch of the pen was small, yet the stroke rang like a vow. His hand was steady, the letters bold, as though carved into the boards themselves. Margaret stared, tears filling her eyes, not tears of shame or fear, but of something deeper. No one had ever written her name into permanence before. Elias lifted his gaze, voice carrying a steady power. The past may chase us, but this house belongs to the present and to those who choose to stay. His words were not only for her. He knew the news would spread by morning. Dust Hollow would learn that Elias Rowe had placed his wife's name beside his on the deeds, a rare thing in a land where men clutched every acre for themselves. It was not romance. It was declaration. Margaret was not a shadow, not a guest in another's home. She was co-owner, equal, bound to the land as he was. Margaret laid trembling fingers on the fresh ink. "You did not need to," she whispered. "I did," Elias answered. His eyes, calm but resolute, did not waver. "I want them to see you stand beside me, not behind. From this day, no one will call you dependent or stranger. You are mistress of this ranch, as much as I am master." Outside, the wind brushed the fields, carrying the distant chime of a cowbell. Margaret heard it like a hymn of ascent. For years, she had lived under suspicion, stripped of dignity, cast out. Now, man had not only chosen her, but anchored her into the very soil of his life. By the next day, the town buzzed. In the saloon, at the mercantile, on the church steps, they whispered, Rowe put his wife's name on the deed. Some scowled, some scoffed, but many grew quiet, thoughtful. Whatever they felt, none could deny. Elias had acted in the open, and Elias Rowe was not a man easily moved. That evening, the Brennans arrived with a basket of bread. Nora's eyes still carried an echo of something unspoken, but her voice was earnest. "I heard the news. Elias, you did what few men would dare. And Margaret, you're not only his wife now, you are mistress of this place. I hope you'll count us as true neighbors." Margaret smiled faintly, soft but clear. She saw the lingering shadow in Nora, but her words had lightened some of the burden. As they saw the Brennans off, Elias placed his hand over Margaret's. "I don't want a marriage built on words alone. I want proof, ink, and witness. And now the whole town has seen." Margaret bowed her head, tears slipping silent. Yet inside she felt her feet set firm upon the land. For the first time in years, she belonged, not as a guest, not as an exile, but as half the heart of a home. That night, as darkness swallowed the prairie and snow began to drift from a gray sky, Elias paused on the porch. From within, a faint oil lamp cast its glow across the window pane. He bent, swept Margaret into his arms as though she weighed no more than the wind. She startled, gasped softly, then broke into a laugh, a sound so clear it spilled into the empty night like a bell. The wooden door groaned as it opened. Elias carried her across the threshold, his boots striking the boards not as those of a solitary man, but of one who no longer walked alone. The door shut, shutting out the wind, leaving only the warmth of the small cabin. Margaret clung to his shoulder, feeling the strength of him, the rhythm of his heart. When he set her down, their eyes caught and held, silence spreading, tender and unhurried. He let go only to take her hand again. The house had known silence, wind through the cracks, footsteps heavy and solitary. Now came the hush of shared breath, the whisper of skirts, laughter awkward yet alive. Margaret's gaze swept the room, the resin-scented timbers, the rough-hewn table, the hearth where Elias had once sat alone through long winters. Tonight, under the lamp's glow, nothing seemed bare. Her shadow joined his on the wall. Her footsteps etched themselves alongside his on the floor. Elias stirred the fire. Flames leapt, casting amber light across the room. Turning, he saw her seated on the bench, rubbing her hands together for warmth. He reached for the thick woolen shawl draped over the chair and placed it around her shoulders. "This house was cold," he said, voice low. "But now it is different. Now it has you." Margaret lifted her eyes, the dark depths gleaming, not with despair, but with the quiet light of belonging. "A house doesn't need grandeur," she whispered. "Only someone willing to stay. And I will stay." They sat together before the blaze. Elias spoke of the land, the summer grasses that reached his waist, the winters that buried the fields in white, the springs when calves were born. Margaret listened, a smile faint on her lips. Then she told of Boston, not the rumors, but her pupils, the sound of recitation, the autumn leaves along wide avenues. Their words wove together, drawing them past old wounds into something plain and human. As the fire sank low, Elias rose and offered his hand. "Tonight," he said, "there need be no grand vows, only this. We walk forward together. Tomorrow we return to work, to land, to people. But tonight, let us know this house is no longer empty." Margaret placed her hand in his, letting him lead her upstairs. Their steps creaked on the wooden stair, and that small sound, 2 sets of footfalls, was a new song in a house long used to silence. The bed was plain, blankets heavy. Margaret shed her snow-damp coat and sat while Elias set the lamp on the table. The light spread soft across the room. They lingered, hesitant, knowing they closed one chapter to interruption, open another. No masks, no pretense. They came together as survivors, scarred, yet unafraid to place their hands on another's beating heart. Outside, wind rattled the eaves. Inside, Margaret laughed softly, Elias answering with a low chuckle. Their laughter twined, filling the timbers, seeping into the walls that had borne long loneliness. Snow glittered under the moon, wrapping the prairie in white. Within, the house carried for the first time the sound of laughter, of life, of hope. And as the night deepened, with 2 souls leaning into each other, a new chapter began. Not perfect, not polished, but true. If you too have known loss or wounds slow to heal, may the story of Elias and Margaret remind you. No matter the years, no matter the scars, the heart can still find its harbor. If this tale has touched your memory or warmed your spirit, leave a word in the comments. Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so together we may keep these gentle stories alive, for us and for the generations yet to come.